Tonight, we navigate the invisible anxieties of life under the Soviet Union. This survival story isn't about war. It's about the psychological toll of political fear and persistent scarcity. Close your eyes and feel the low hum of the state. We seek peace in the quiet act of remembering those who endured. Before this video continues, I just want to say something from the heart. It takes me days of effort and sleepless nights to bring you these videos, but very few people subscribe. I'm honestly disheartened because every video I make is for you, to entertain, inspire, and give you something meaningful to watch. Please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe. Your support means everything to me. It's the only thing that keeps me motivated to work harder and bring you even better content every time. Life under the Soviet Union was characterized by a pervasive, invisible anxiety, the constant, low-level fear that every word, every gesture, and every friendship was being watched. This psychological pressure, enforced not just by prison guards, but by the shadow of the state security apparatus, the KGB or its predecessors, the NKVD, MVD, was the most difficult condition to survive. The physical structure of Soviet urban life was designed to destroy the concept of individual privacy. The vast majority of city dwellers lived in kommunalka, or communal apartments, where several unrelated families shared a single kitchen, bathroom, and hallway, each family occupying just one or two small rooms. One imagined the atmosphere in the long, dark corridor of a kommunalka late at night. The air is heavy with the lingering smell of cabbage soup and cheap tobacco. Every sound is transmitted through the thin plaster walls. The soft creak of floorboards, the muffled whisper of a conversation, the drip of a faucet. Nothing is truly private. This forced intimacy was deliberate. It fostered a culture of mutual suspicion. Your neighbor was not just a fellow tenant. They were your potential informer. A loud complaint about the lack of meat, a slightly off-colored joke about Lenin, or a letter received from abroad. Any of these could be overheard, misinterpreted, and reported. Your survival depended on maintaining a perfect, impenetrable silence about your true feelings, knowing that the most dangerous person in your life was often the one sleeping just 6 feet away, on the other side of a flimsy partition. The constant, low-grade anxiety of being overheard was a non-stop drain on the human spirit. Technology, rather than offering connection, often served as another terrifying tool of the state. The telephone, especially in the era of Stalin's purges, was less a means of communication and more an instrument of dread. There was a specific fear associated with the telephone, the silent hang-up call. Imagine the heavy, jarring ring of the old-fashioned Bakelite telephone late in the evening. You rush to answer it, perhaps breathing a sigh of relief that it's just a wrong number. But when you pick up, there is only the dead, empty silence on the other end, followed by the soft click of the disconnection. Was it a spy, checking if you were home? Was it a neighbor, testing your reaction? Was it the NKVD, confirming your address before sending a car? That moment of silent uncertainty was a psychological weapon. It taught the Soviet citizen that they were always on the grid, always traceable, and always potentially under observation. This recurring, simple event The silent phone call reinforced the constant need for low-profile living and served as a chilling, quiet reminder that the omnipresent state was very much aware of your existence. The most iconic and terrifying symbol of Soviet state power was the knock on the door in the middle of the night. This was the culmination of all the anxiety the moment the shadow of fear materialized into a physical threat. The most frequent time for an arrest was between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., when the victim was deepest in sleep, most disoriented, and least able to resist or reason. Imagine being pulled from a deep sleep by the sound that stops the heart, the loud, authoritative rat-tat-tat of heavy knuckles or a rifle butt on the door. The sound echoes terrifyingly in the cramped space of the kommunalka, instantly waking every other family behind their thin doors. The subsequent silence is thick, filled only with the heavy, panicked breathing of the victims and the quiet, deliberate movements of the plainclothes agents outside. The arrest itself was often conducted with chilling efficiency and minimal noise. There was no shouting, no public spectacle, if it could be avoided. Only the quiet, firm command to dress, the rustle of papers being signed by a terrified witness, often the neighbor, and the soft thud of the door closing behind the arrested person. The silence that fell back over the kommunalka after the victim was taken away was the coldest silence imaginable, the silence of fear, relief, and instant, practiced forgetting. This sudden, arbitrary removal of citizens, whether professor, peasant, or party member, was the state's ultimate survival test, designed to ensure that no one ever felt secure. For the survivors, those who were left behind after the knock, the primary rule of continuing existence was the establishment of the code of silence. This was a mechanism of psychological defense, a necessary act of self-censorship that extended to communication, memory, and conscience. The rule was simple: do not speak of the arrest. Do not ask about the disappeared. Do not remember the victim. Imagine the conversation the morning after the knock. The neighbors share a kitchen, but their eyes meet only briefly, evasively. The children are told that the person went away on assignment or moved to a new factory. The name of the arrested person is physically removed from documents, photos, and daily conversation. This willful, instant erasure was a survival mechanism. To acknowledge the arbitrary cruelty was to admit that the same fate could befall you. The internal silence was the heaviest burden of all. You survived by forcing your mind to wall off entire sections of memory and emotion. The sound of your own voice, even in the privacy of your room, became suspect. Every word had to be filtered through the state's ideology, transforming internal life into a performance. This profound psychological toll, the forced silence, the denial of truth, and the constant fear that you might slip up and say the wrong thing, was the ultimate silent test of survival under the Soviet regime. Survival under the Soviet Union was a daily, exhausting struggle against a deeply flawed system of persistent scarcity. Life was not defined by wealth or ambition, but by the overwhelming, monotonous effort required to secure basic necessities: food, shoes, or a coat. The constant stress of provisioning was a profound, non-physical toll that wore down the spirit. The rhythm of life was often dictated by the arrival of a supply lorry carrying goods to the state-run stores. Because the central planning system was notoriously inefficient, deliveries were sporadic and unpredictable. Rumor, rather than schedule, was the most reliable indicator of a delivery. Imagine the atmosphere in a quiet residential district. Suddenly, the loud, distinctive rumble of an old Soviet lorry is heard, perhaps grinding its gears as it slows near the local gastronome, grocery store. This sound, which in a capitalist society would signify commerce, in the USSR signified immediate action. It was the signal that a highly desired item, perhaps butter, decent sausage, or winter boots, might be available. Almost instantaneously, the queue would begin to form. People would abandon chores, leave their apartments, and take their place, often without even knowing exactly what was being sold. The queue was a test of patience, discipline, and endurance. People stood for hours, sometimes wrapping blocks. The only sound, the low murmur of quiet gossip, and the shuffling of feet in the cold. To survive, you needed not only money, but the time and resilience to stand in line, day after day, year after year, just to maintain a basic standard of living. The psychological burden of scarcity was the absence of choice. When a Soviet citizen entered a state store, they were not faced with a dazzling array of options. They were faced with a perpetual lack of goods. Shelves were often sparsely stocked with identical, low-quality, and unappealing items. A display of official output, not consumer demand. If you needed toothpaste, you bought the only brand available. If you needed sausage, you bought the single, gray, fatty variety on offer. The phrase, "Nayet nichigo," there is nothing, was a common sound, often delivered by the indifferent sales clerk. Imagine the quiet desperation of needing a specific item, say, a durable light bulb or a pair of children's shoes, and finding the shelf utterly bare. The money in your pocket, the ruble, was functionally useless without goods to purchase. This forced constant lowering of expectations, this resignation to accepting the lowest common denominator, was a daily battle against demoralization. Survival was learning to live with low-grade dissatisfaction and suppressing the desire for quality or variety, accepting that the state decided what you deserved and when. The official state economy's failure to provide necessities created a massive, parallel structure essential for survival: the black market, or Cherny Rynok. This was the shadow economy, where blat, connections, and illicit trade filled the gaping holes left by central planning. The black market wasn't always a dark alley. It was often conducted through quiet, whispered transactions among trusted networks. It was the factory worker who secretly diverted a few bolts of fabric, the doctor who traded Western medicine for high-quality food, or the person selling a stolen pair of foreign jeans at the local flea market. Imagine the tension of a Cherny Rynok transaction. The seller approaches with a low, hesitant voice, whispering the price in foreign currency or in terms of exchange. "Edie, I need vodka for the boots." The buyer examines the item quickly, their eyes constantly scanning for the police. The sound of money changing hands is a brief, muffled crinkle of illegal currency. This necessary hustle was the only way to acquire high-quality, durable, or luxury goods. Survival meant participating in a low-level, continuous illegality, a quiet, calculated risk taken simply to make life tolerable. Under capitalism, money represents purchasing power. Under the Soviet system, the ruble held a deeply paradoxical value. You earned the ruble through state employment, but because the state failed to produce desirable goods in sufficient quantities, the money often felt weightless and useless. The real currency in the USSR was not the ruble, but access and goods. A person with a good job had a steady salary, but the person with access to a specialized distribution point, like a factory store or a party dacha store, had power. A can of imported Polish meat or a piece of foreign chewing gum could often be a more valuable trading commodity than a fistful of rubles. Imagine the feeling of receiving your monthly wage, a large, numerical sum, and then spending hours in a queue, only to realize that the one thing you desperately need is simply not available for purchase anywhere. This disconnect created a profound sense of economic futility. The daily routine of going to work was purely for the illusion of function. The true survival effort began after work, in the queues, and in the quiet, illegal exchanges of the Cherny Rynok. The struggle to provide was a continuous, exhausting stressor that robbed people of energy and peace. Survival in the Soviet Union required navigating not just physical scarcity and political fear, but a constant, overwhelming flood of propaganda that invaded every corner of private and public life. This relentless noise of state control forced citizens into a psychological double life, creating profound stress between what they were forced to say and what they truly believed. Propaganda was not limited to newspapers and grand parades. It was woven into the micro-architecture of daily life. Every factory, office, communal apartment hallway, and village meeting house featured a red corner, Krasny Ugolok. This was a dedicated space, often brightly lit, adorned with portraits of the party leadership, Lenin, Stalin, etc. Red banners, revolutionary slogans, and charts celebrating impossible production targets. Imagine entering your workplace or walking down the dim, shared corridor of your kommunalka. The red corner is a mandatory sight, a permanent, silent sentinel of state ideology. The portraits look down with an unnerving, constant gaze, and the slogans demand your endless sacrifice. Even the color red, dominating these spaces, was a constant, visual reminder of the party's claim to your loyalty. This perpetual display served as a constant psychological pressure point. It ensured that even in your most mundane moments, waiting for a kettle to boil or punching a time card, you were reminded of the absolute primacy of the party. Survival meant mastering the art of the blank gaze, seeing the symbols without absorbing them, acknowledging their presence without letting them penetrate your private thoughts. The most pervasive and inescapable tool of psychological control was the state-controlled radio network. In nearly every home, apartment, and public square, a small, simple speaker, the loudspeaker, was permanently installed, often wired directly to the central broadcast hub. These broadcasts were a source of information, but primarily a constant, inescapable channel for official state narrative. Imagine waking up to the loud, tinny, and slightly distorted blare of the radio commentator's voice, announcing the glorious successes of the latest 5-year plan. or denouncing the counter-revolutionary schemes of foreign spies. Even if you physically turned off the local switch, a low-volume hum often persisted, a ghost sound reminding you that the connection to the state was always active. The sound of the radio was the sound of manufactured consensus. It dictated the official version of reality, that the Soviet harvest was the best in the world, even when you were standing in a bread queue, that life was improving exponentially, and that the only threats came from outside the Soviet paradise. To survive, you had to develop a deep, internal ability to tune out the blare, to let the noise wash over you while simultaneously trying to extract tiny kernels of actual information, often conveyed through subtle shifts in tone or deliberate omissions. The constant, intrusive noise of the official truth was a brutal form of psychological pollution. The ultimate adaptation required for survival was living a double life. The Soviet citizen had to maintain an outwardly perfect mask of enthusiasm, loyalty, and ideological purity for public consumption, while simultaneously holding a completely separate, secret, and often cynical inner life of private thought. This double existence required constant vigilance. Imagine being at a mandatory party meeting, standing up to deliver a scripted criticism of an imperialist policy or to offer effusive praise for a Politburo member. Your voice is loud, clear, and utterly convincing, adopting the approved political jargon. Yet, internally, your mind is silently tallying the items you need from the Cherny Rhinoc, or worrying about the neighbor who hasn't been seen for a week. This internal split, the need to filter every word through a state-approved sieve, created immense cognitive dissonance. The constant suppression of genuine thought and emotion was mentally exhausting. The stress of this performance, the fear that a single slip of the tongue, a moment of weariness, or an expression of doubt might shatter the mask, was a relentless, quiet pressure that lasted for decades. You survived by becoming a consummate, self-policing actor in a play written by the state. The core message of the propaganda was the illusion of progress, symbolized by the 5-year plans. These were massive, overarching economic targets that promised monumental achievement and rapid advancement into a communist future, usually at the expense of current living conditions. Every poster, every radio broadcast, and every factory wall displayed statistics, graphs, and heroic images dedicated to the plan. The sound of this rhetoric was loud, bombastic, and deeply optimistic, constantly demanding more effort and sacrifice for a future that seemed to perpetually recede into the distance. Imagine standing in a queue for hours just to buy potatoes, while the loudspeaker above you loudly proclaims that Soviet steel production has surpassed the entire capitalist world. The gap between the loud, official reality and the quiet, personal reality was immense. Survival meant accepting this necessary lie. The lie that today's suffering was temporary and that the radiant future was just around the corner. To publicly question the plan, to point out the empty shelves while the radio blared statistics of abundance, was an act of political sabotage. You survived by compartmentalizing your vision, focusing only on the small, immediate needs of the day, and letting the loud, grand rhetoric simply become part of the background noise. In the Soviet Union, the concept of work was profoundly divorced from individual reward. Labor was the state's most powerful tool for ideological control and social organization, demanding constant presence and minimal incentive. Survival meant enduring the monotony, low output, and psychological exhaustion that defined the Soviet workplace. The Soviet state placed immense value on heavy industry and massive factories, symbolized by the party's obsession with steel, coal, and tractor production. For millions, the daily reality was the factory floor, a place of deafening noise, poor ventilation, and outdated machinery. Imagine standing on the floor of a Soviet steel mill or assembly plant. The dominant sound is the relentless, crashing, high-volume clang of metal on metal, the hiss of steam, and the low, powerful thrum of aging, inefficient machinery. The air is thick with the smell of oil, metal filings, and coal dust. The physical environment was often harsh and dangerous, but the work itself was strangely low intensity. Because central planning failed to provide consistent supplies or incentives, the workflow was inherently erratic. There were periods of Sturmovщина, storming, where workers raced frantically to meet a quota at the end of the month, followed by long periods of bureaucratic stagnation, where workers spent hours waiting for materials to arrive. The sound of real productive work was intermittent, often replaced by the sound of bored workers quietly talking or tinkering with broken equipment. You survived by learning to pace yourself, to look busy without expending unnecessary energy, and by mastering the art of the oczkowytyratelstwo, pulling the wool over the eyes of the supervisor. The Soviet economic model was designed to eliminate the exploitation of capitalism, but in doing so, it created a massive problem of motivation. Wages and career advancement were largely dictated by party loyalty, seniority, or bureaucratic position, not by individual effort or quality of output. The system was characterized by wage leveling, uravnilovka. The best worker often earned only slightly more than the worst worker. The consequence was predictable. Why work hard? Why strive for perfection when your reward is the same as the person who spends half the day smoking or reading? Imagine the quiet cynicism of the workforce. The slogan painted on the wall reads, "Labor is a matter of honor, a matter of glory," but the reality is the low, weary sigh of a worker watching the clock. The sound of honest, focused, productive effort was often absent. The primary motivation was simply showing up, prisutstvie, to retain your state-provided housing, your ration card, and your basic job security. You survived not by giving 100% effort, but by mastering the mediocrity required for bureaucratic survival, reserving your true energy for the queues and the black market. Beyond the daily workplace, the state demanded periodic acts of communal, mandatory labor known as the subotnik, literally from subota, or Saturday. These were unpaid, voluntary in name only weekend shifts, often dedicated to cleaning public spaces, harvesting fields, or working on minor construction projects. The tradition was started by Lenin as an ideological effort to promote revolutionary enthusiasm. Imagine waking up on Saturday, your one day of rest, and instead being required to join a massive column of workers marching to a muddy field or a dusty construction site. The sounds of the subotnik were not the usual factory clangs, but the scrape of hundreds of shovels against dirt, the sound of light laughter, often forced, and the loud, cheerful music broadcast over loudspeakers to maintain the facade of enthusiasm. These events were a massive drain on physical and mental reserves. They were not about efficiency, they were about ideological spectacle, forcing citizens to demonstrate public loyalty and participation in the collective effort. The energy you had preserved during the week's low-effort factory work was now spent on this mandatory, unpaid task. You survived the Subotnik by feigning enthusiasm, moving slowly, and focusing only on the final, sweet reward, the certainty that the ordeal would end by the afternoon. The psychological survival of a Soviet citizen was often tested not by physical labor, but by the relentless, monotonous pressure of the endless bureaucratic meeting. Sobranaye, the party ruled through committee, and meetings were mandatory, frequent, and often stretched late into the evening. These meetings were dominated by lengthy, repetitive speeches filled with impenetrable political jargon and required self-criticism. They were where ideological discipline was enforced and where the individual was forced to confess real or imaginary political shortcomings. Imagine the atmosphere in a poorly lit, smoke-filled room. The sound is the monotonous drone of the speaker's voice, reading from prepared notes, punctuated by the occasional muffled cough or the soft thud of a nodding head hitting the table. Sleep was often the only refuge. The purpose of these sessions was not decision-making, it was psychological attrition, the slow, systematic draining of the will to resist or question. You survived the meeting by learning to sit perfectly still, appearing attentive while mentally detaching, allowing the loud, official words to simply become a meaningless background sound while preserving your inner world. For the vast majority of those arrested under the Soviet system, survival was measured by endurance against the most brutal climate and the most crushing labor system ever conceived. The Gulag Archipelago, this network of forced labor camps stretching across the freezing, unforgiving expanse of the Siberian taiga and the far north, was the final, devastating test of human survival. The journey to the Gulag began immediately after the knock and the interrogation. The arrested individual was packed into a Stolopin car, a specialized railway carriage designed for transporting prisoners, often converted cattle cars. This journey could last for weeks, sometimes months, across the vast Soviet Union. Imagine the atmosphere inside the cramped, windowless car. The air is stale and bitterly cold, especially during the long Russian winter. The car is packed far beyond capacity, forcing prisoners to sit or stand shoulder to shoulder in suffocating proximity. The dominant sound is the monotonous, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the wheels on the train tracks, a sound that becomes a psychological torment, the constant rhythm of a journey with an unknown, terrifying destination. There are also the quiet, muffled moans of the sick and the low, whispered exchange of information and rumors about the camps ahead. Survival on the transport meant enduring extreme hunger, thirst, disease, and the constant psychological pressure of confinement. It was the first, and often the most lethal, filter of the Gulag system. You survived the journey not through strength, but through the ability to find a tiny, cold space to breathe and to mentally detach from the relentless, jarring rhythm of the moving box. Upon arrival at the destination, often deep in the frozen taiga, boreal forests, or the Arctic tundra, the prisoner faced the immediate, visceral shock of the climate. These camps were deliberately placed in the most resource-rich, yet geographically hostile, parts of the country, where the extreme cold was as effective a guard as any rifle. Imagine stepping off the train and feeling the air hit you, the sharp, burning cold that instantly seizes the lungs. The silence of the vast, frozen forest is absolute, broken only by the crunching sound of footsteps on packed snow and the barks of the guard dogs. The temperature often plummeted 2 or lower. The taiga presented a dual threat: the cold that kills quickly through exposure, and the sheer emptiness that eliminates any hope of escape. Survival meant immediately acknowledging the absolute power of the environment. The prisoner's thin, inadequate clothing was no match for the Russian winter. The fight for survival began the instant the train doors opened, shifting from a political struggle to a raw, biological contest against the cold. The Gulag was an economic system built on forced, punitive labor, primarily focused on logging, mining, and construction. The key to the system was the daily quota, a production target set deliberately high, often impossible to achieve, especially with malnutrition and primitive tools. Imagine standing in the freezing forest, handed a simple, dull saw or a worn pickaxe. The task is to cut an enormous volume of timber or extract a heavy tonnage of frozen ore. The sound is the weary huff of men trying to swing an axe in the bitter cold, the dull thud of a tree falling, a momentary victory, and the constant, high-pitched whine of the wind through the bare trees. If a prisoner failed to meet their quota, they were severely punished, most crucially by being moved to a punishment ration, a smaller, inadequate portion of food, since the standard ration was barely enough to sustain the heavy labor. The punishment ration was a sentence of slow starvation. Survival was a constant, exhausting calculation. How to expend just enough energy to meet the quota and avoid the punishment ration, while preserving just enough strength to survive the night. This impossible equation was the silent mechanism of the Gulag's mortality rate. The only respite from the day's back-breaking labor was the return to the communal barracks. These were long, overcrowded wooden huts, with primitive, tiered sleeping platforms. Nary, however, the barracks were not a place for rest, but for the final, psychological test of the day. Imagine lying on the hard, freezing nary. The air is foul, with the smell of unwashed bodies, smoke, and illness. The dominant sound is the low, uneven rhythm of communal coughing, mixed with the soft squeak of rats moving in the shadows. The real key to survival here was absolute silence. There was a strict, unspoken code. Do not draw attention to yourself. Do not complain. Do not argue. And do not make any noise that could attract the attention of a guard or a criminal element among the prisoners. You survived by shrinking your physical and emotional presence, becoming a silent, inanimate object that simply endured the night. The only people allowed to break the silence were the uchasniki, trustees, or the criminal element, blatny, whose loud, cruel noises often dominated the night. For the political prisoner, peace came only through mental withdrawal, closing your eyes, forcing your breathing to be shallow, and entering a state of semi-conscious endurance, waiting for the dreaded but inevitable sound of the wake-up gong that signaled the start of another impossible day. The harsh whistle of the factory floor is gone. The anxious wait in the long queue is over. You've endured the constant pressure of silence and scarcity. You are safe now, outside the reach of the 3 a.m. knock. Breathe slowly and drift into a deep, profound sleep, finally free from the burdens of the collective.